Roy Wilson was born in 1900 in the town of Kettering in Northamptonshire. In childhood he showed an obvious enthusiasm and talent for drawing, but in 1918 he joined the army for 2 years. In 1920 a chance encounter in a local pub turned out to be a life-changing moment when he fell into conversation with Don Newhouse, some 17 years his senior, who had a proven track record as one of Britain's most successful comic strip artists. When he saw some of Wilson's drawings, he immediately hired him as his assistant, and the strip Roland Butter and Ham and Eggs was their first collaboration in 1921. Even from the beginning of their association, Wilson was considerably more than an assistant to Newhouse, but despite the volume and level of his creative contributions throughout their professional relationship, he was never credited as such. But he was nevertheless grateful for the regular work, which meant that by 1924 he felt financially secure enough to get married and buy a house. Their most popular strip of the period was the worldwide wanderings of Basil and Bert, who travelled widely to different countries and even back in time, giving Wilson ample opportunities to indulge his predilection for visual anarchy. And it was largely due to Wilson's uncanny knack for creating the illusion of energetic movement, which really drove the narratives of these strips. Who did what in the creation of these thoroughly enjoyable escapades remains unknown, but the energetic evocations of movement and speed look more like Wilson than Newhouse to me, and it is known that on some occasions Newhouse's only contribution was the speech balloon lettering. In the late 1920s, an editor at the Amalgamated Press persuaded the overly modest Wilson to start submitting work under his own name. Wilson happily responded with ideas of his own, and his most successful early solo outing was the cowboy-themed Steve and Stumpy in 1930, which proved to be a popular creation. But there were others with different themes, although remarkably similar narratives. But he was still playing second fiddle to Newhouse, who had earlier taken over the strip Pitch and Toss from another artist in the early 1920s. And it was far from coincidental that the greater Wilson's involvement with the production and execution of this series, the more popular it became. And by the 1930s, the adventures of these two amiable but inept sailors and their anthropomorphic chums Ockie and Pengy had been elevated to front-page status. This was undoubtedly due to Wilson's uncanny facility for slapstick humour, and he created many dazzlingly complex panels containing highly plausible graphic evocations of all manner of movement and disastrous events. At this point, in addition to his own creations, he was still also working with Newhouse, but the constant pressure of deadlines and his immense workload quickly started to have an adverse effect on his health. And in 1931, after suffering a minor breakdown, his doctor ordered him to stop working completely until he had recovered. But within a year he was back at his drawing board, and in 1933 he finally ended his association with Don Newhouse. This enabled him to produce yet more comic creations of his own, and although he continued to work incredibly long hours, frequently through the night, to ensure that his drawings were as expressive and entertaining as he could make them, the added stress of working for Newhouse was finally in the past. The comic panels he produced were created separately, and the originals were usually around 6 inches by 4 and assembled and formatted at the printers. And Wilson used both a pen and a brush to create a wide range of stroke widths, from energetic linear hatching through to bolder, more calligraphic gestural outlines. Up to the 1930s, Wilson's work had only ever appeared in monochrome, but in the middle of the decade they started to be occasionally printed in colour, which was applied to Wilson's monochrome originals at printing as a series of overlays. Whether he had any supervisory involvement in the colouring process isn't recorded, but it was done quite successfully, which suggests that he did. But by far the majority of his strips continued to be printed in black and white only, and such was his prowess with brush and pen that the absence of colour mattered little. Moggy the Mouser was among other conspicuous successes for Wilson at this time, and this anthropomorphic cat was a particularly accomplished knockabout series. It was also in the later 1930s that it became widespread practice to reformat back issues of the various comics published by the Amalgamated Press as annuals in book form. Wilson was a popular choice to create the cover illustrations, and in this context he was able to work with watercolour washes to enhance and give volume to his always absorbing images. Pitch and toss were regular favourites for these covers, and the visual delight inherent in all these cheerful painted scenes was every bit as rewarding as the more admired work of those creating children's book illustration at the time. And in addition to these covers, Wilson was also commissioned to produce yet more full-colour riotous scenarios for the pages. This astonishingly complex but never completed full-colour illustration gives us an insight into his working methods, and it's easy to see from this discarded original artwork how the images were built up and solidified from the lightest and most gestural of descriptive sketches. In the comics themselves, Wilson also started creating some spectacularly detailed, complex full-page compositions and banner headings for the covers, which were printed in vibrant flat colour from his black and white pen drawings. The cover images he produced for the comic Happy Days were some of the most engaging visual celebrations of childhood silliness you could ever hope to see. It was obvious that it was with such work that he was in his element, and his uncanny ability to create crowded compositions of highly amusing anthropomorphic characters had few, if any, equals. With ever-increasing competition from other publishers, in 1938 the Amalgamated Press brought in some new titles which exploited the popularity of current radio and film stars. Wilson's earliest celebrity strip was Stymie and His Magic Wishbone, which featured the character played by the black American child actor Matthew Beard Jr. in the Our Gang series of films. Wilson not only imported the character, billed as a dark little lad with bright ideas, into a British setting, but rendered him as an unfortunately generic comic stereotype, complete with a plantation accent. Of course, it wasn't considered remotely inappropriate by anyone at the time, especially in a country whose population was almost exclusively white. When war came in 1939, Wilson was too old for the army, and he kept working throughout, and alongside his weekly output of strips, he also created more lively watercolour covers featuring Pitch and Toss, by now his most enduring creations. He also enjoyed considerable success during the war with another celebrity strip featuring the popular British comedian Tommy Handley and his knockabout battles with the elusive German spy character Funf. Wilson also created a military-themed strip at this time featuring the exploits of Private Muggins and his pet mouse, but actual conflict with the enemy was never featured. But other than these examples, Wilson continued with his usual topics, working primarily in monochrome and two-colour print, and less frequently his masterful watercolour annual covers and pages. Following the end of the war, Wilson made a rare appearance outside comics, with his character Dragamuffin, and related images for children to colour, which were popular if only for a couple of years in Woman's Own magazine. But by the 1960s the times were very much changing, and Wilson, along with others, was starting to be considered rather old-fashioned. Other comics, and particularly those published by D.C. Thomson, had by this point easily overtaken the Amalgamated Press. And there was also the increasing popularity of the superhero comic imports from the USA. Wilson and his contemporaries were by this point far less in demand, but he did continue to create celebrity-themed strips, such as his series about the imaginary exploits of personalities such as the comedic actors Terry Thomas and Harry Seacombe, which continued to be energetically rendered and tried to reflect a more contemporary view of British society. In 1964 he started a new strip featuring the immensely popular comedy duo Morecambe and Wise. But not long after it began to appear, he was diagnosed with terminal cancer, and he died a year later at the age of only 65. The legacy of Roy Wilson's comic style persists to this day, although it hasn't travelled much beyond this little island. It occurs to me that had he been a children's book illustrator, he would probably have been better known and certainly better paid, and for the life of me I can't imagine why he didn't. But he stuck with comics for his entire working life, and although he lived comfortably enough, he never enjoyed the greater financial rewards that come from ongoing royalty payments. But I, for one, continue to take immense pleasure in the endlessly entertaining and agreeably anarchic quality of the pictures he created, just as I did when I was about 8 years old and saw them for the very first time.